Hello, everyone, and welcome to session one of our course called Exploring Daniel When God Invades a Broken World. As I've been thinking about, preparing, praying for this class, God has spoken powerfully to my heart to give me encouragement, to exhort me and challenge me to faithfulness as we continue to serve Him in this broken world in which we live. This is a wonderfully powerful, complex story, but filled with meaning and filled with impact if we're willing to put the work in. So we're ready to begin this wonderful study, and I'm glad you decided to join me. So let's begin with a few topics for discussion. We're going to begin in session one with an introduction. That's today. We're going to look at the historical context in which Daniel is written. And then in session two, and next week, we're going to look at the big picture. Sometimes when we look at Daniel, we get a little sidetracked by all the different episodes. It has such a wonderfully complex content to it. Sometimes we get distracted with this piece or that piece, and we focus on those, and we lose the big picture, the forest, as we focus on the trees. So we want to make sure we get that big picture that's so carefully planned and organized in this book. And then in the third session, we'll start to get into the tricky bits, the images, especially the images of the kingdoms. What do those images and symbols represent? The statues, the beasts, are they images of past kingdoms, present, future? We're going to look into all that. And then in session four, we'll look at those mysterious time references. Time, times, and half a time. 77s. What's that all about? Is that a concrete, literal reference to time, or are those symbolic references? Do they apply again to our past, our present, our future? We need to look at all that. And then in our last session, we're going to look at the combination of history and prophecy that we find in Daniel. In those last few chapters, chapters 10 through 12, we see the closing visions that pull together all these themes that have been woven throughout the story, and they do it in a powerful way. They show how God uses history to give us confidence about the future, confidence in the prophecy that He's making. But prophecy also helps us to understand history. Why did God do what He did? These are questions that are addressed in these powerful final chapters. So that's our agenda. 5 sessions, impossible to cover the complex, beautiful story of Daniel in those 5 sessions, but we're going to give it a go anyway. I'm glad you decided to join us. So now let's take a look at the historical context in which the book of Daniel was written. And we'll let you know right up front that we're going to take a traditional approach. We believe that the book of Daniel was written in the 6th century BC, that it is an accurate portrayal of an historic figure named Daniel who lived during this period. When history is given, it's intended to be history, not myth or legend. The prophecies that he sees are events that are intended to take place. So we're going to take this traditional approach. Now, if we follow the story then of Daniel and we take it at its word, it begins in about 605 BC when Nebuchadnezzar takes him into captivity into Babylon. He stays in Babylon through the entire extent of his ministry. We're not sure exactly when he dies. The last reference we have in Daniel itself is in chapter 10 to the 3rd year of Cyrus. Beyond that, we're not sure. Cyrus himself dies in 530 BC, probably in battle. Since there are no other references in Daniel to another ruler past Cyrus, we assume that's where Daniel's ministry ends. So we pick a year of 530 BC, the year of Cyrus's death, and assume that's kind of the end of Daniel's life somewhere in there. But we don't really know. It is interesting, however, that there are 2 tombs out there, 2 places that commemorate his life. One is in Uzbekistan, and the other is among the ruins of Susa in Iran. So in those 2 places, there is this tradition, at least, of Daniel being a historical person that died in that place. So in chapter 1 of Daniel, we have kind of the bookends in between which Daniel exercises his ministry. It starts in verse 1, 605 BC, 605 BC, and in verse 21 we get the other side, that he was there throughout until Cyrus comes to power. So that's the framework in which we will be working. Now, we will let you know that though we're taking the traditional approach, there are other interpretations or other approaches that are taken. Right now, many interpreters are assume that the book was written much later, in the 2nd century BC. We'll talk about that more as the story unfolds, but we want to let you know up front there are these two options, and we have chosen to approach it from a traditional point of view. So let's jump in then to the beginning, the first bookend, the front end, when Nebuchadnezzar takes Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar at this point is not yet the king of Babylon. He is on military campaigns on behalf of his father. And we know that about 605 BC, he was in this general area, the area of Israel and Syria. It is there that he defeats the Egyptians in the famous Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. And according to the story in Daniel, this is when Nebuchadnezzar captures him and takes him back to Babylon. Well, we will let you know up front, though, that this is a bit of a controversial topic among interpreters. Daniel is the only place that records the captivity of people from Judah during this particular time when Nebuchadnezzar was in the area. It is not recorded in extra biblical sources. And in the other report we have of captives within the Bible itself, mostly in Jeremiah 52, Jeremiah doesn't even mention it. He mentions 3 other times when captives were taken, but not the one that Daniel mentions. So, as you might imagine, there are interpreters out there who assume then that this is legend, that this did not really happen. The author is kind of making up this story. But I would submit that it is certainly feasible that this occurs. This is what the book says. We know that Nebuchadnezzar was in that area. It's not unthinkable that he took captives with him. Carchemish is in Syria, north of Israel. We don't know where he captured Daniel from, but it might be one of those many cases where initially there's no evidence that the Bible is historically accurate, but then later on, archaeological discoveries, documentary evidence is found to verify the story as it is told in the scriptures. And I think we may be in one of those cases here. So we're going to assume this is historically accurate, that Nebuchadnezzar did take him to Babylon around 605 BC. Now, Nebuchadnezzar will come back to the area after he becomes king of Babylon, and this begins this new Babylonian empire. He will come back at least 2 more times, and the last time is the devastating one. That's when he destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, takes all the treasures of the temple back to Babylon, and all the time throughout this, he is taking people into captivity. So let's go to the next phase of the story then, and that is the story of captivity. As I mentioned before, Jeremiah mentions 3 different times that captives were taken throughout this period, in addition to the one that Daniel mentions. According to the estimate we have in Jeremiah, there were a total of some 4,600 people taken. Later in the book of Ezra, we discover that when Ezra comes back, that journey from Babylon back to Judah took 5 months to complete. And we know that roughly we're talking about 900 miles. So you can imagine what an arduous journey that would have been for all these people going from Judah all the way to Babylon, some 900 miles by foot, under hard-pressed conditions, maybe taking up to 5 months to make the journey. Clearly, this was a very dehumanizing, demotivating, destroying kind of activity to engage in. And that was the whole point. I mean, that's why Nebuchadnezzar did this. He was seeking not just to destroy and become victor of a kingdom. He's meant to destroy a culture. He's trying to wipe out a culture. He's bringing captives to Babylon to train them to be good Babylonians, to believe what they believed, to worship the way they worshiped, to count the way they counted, to speak their language. He sought to basically wipe out Judaism from the face of the earth. However, he was not successful. Ultimately, Babylon becomes a place where Judaism reinvents and reinvigorates itself. Perhaps you've heard of the Babylonian Talmud, where the traditions of Judaism are assembled and passed on for generations and still affects Jewish life today. So notwithstanding the attempt of the Babylonians to wipe out Judaism, that the Jewish people themselves rebuilt their tradition in a powerful way and continue to reflect those changes even today. Now, we have Daniel's story, the first 70 years of that captivity. He's there the whole time, from the very first time the captives were taken until the time where Cyrus releases them and allows them to go back to Judah. So in all, about 70 or 75 years, Daniel is there, seeing visions, reporting on history, inspiring the people, serving God in that place. So then we turn to the final section, the other bookend, and that's when Cyrus invades Babylon in 539 BC. Cyrus begins in the smaller southern nation of Persia, goes north into Media, west into Babylon. At that point, he defeats the Babylonian armies. He becomes the emperor of all the Persian Empire. And the following year, he issues a decree to allow the people of Judah return to their homeland, return to Jerusalem, and rebuild the temple. We have a copy of that, a report of that in the first chapter of Ezra. It's a reversal of the policy that the Babylonians pursued. As Cyrus sends them home, but when they go home, they're still under his power, under his jurisdiction. They still have to pay taxes back to the Persian Empire, but he does allow them to return. So Daniel was there the whole time, and as I said, the last mention we have in the book of Daniel, time-wise, is the reference to the third year of Cyrus, and that would have been somewhere in the area of 537, 536, somewhere in there. That's the other bookend that encapsulates the whole ministry of Daniel. So in addition to Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus, there are three other kings mentioned in the book of Daniel, and I thought it might be helpful to look at them and talk a little bit about them. It kind of gives some more background into the ministry of Daniel and the situation he was dealing with. The first of those additional kings is a person by the name of Jehoiakim. We see him referenced in the first verse of the first chapter. Now, when the story begins, Jehoiakim was a client king of the Egyptian Pharaoh Necho. He was paying duties and taxes to the Egyptian Pharaoh. But when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and defeats Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish, the situation changes, and now Jehoiakim must pay taxes back to Babylon. But Nebuchadnezzar doesn't stay in the area. He returns to Babylon. He doesn't occupy the lands he conquers, and in his absence, Jehoiakim believes that he can push back. He rebels. He doesn't pay the fees required. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar is not going to let this stand. He reinvades the area. He takes more cities and lands in Judah. And during a siege of Jerusalem at that time, Jehoiakim dies. His son Jeconiah takes the throne, but within 3 months, he is captured and he is taken captive back to Babylon. Interestingly enough, we find a later reference to Jeconiah in 2 Kings 25, where at some point he's released from captivity and is even sitting at the king's table, enjoying fellowship with the king. So an astounding story. But at the time where Nebuchadnezzar first takes Jeconiah captive into Babylon, he appoints Jehoiakim's brother Zedekiah to the throne. Zedekiah becomes the next, and in fact the last king of Judah for this period. Zedekiah at first pays his duty to Nebuchadnezzar, but then, like his brother, when Nebuchadnezzar leaves, he starts to rebel. And this is it for Nebuchadnezzar. He's done. At this point, he reinvades the area, reinvades Judah, and this time he lays siege to Jerusalem and defeats it. He enters Jerusalem, destroys the walls, destroys the city, destroys the temple, takes all the treasures out of the temple, carries it back to Babylon. And Zedekiah then becomes the last king of Judah now for over 500 years. The next time we see a king in Judah is when King Herod makes a negotiated settlement with Rome to assume that title. The next ruler mentioned is Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus. And Nabonidus, in turn, was the successor to Nebuchadnezzar. We're not sure why Nabonidus becomes the next king. He's not related by blood. Maybe he was related through marriage. We're not sure. There's some mystery and all that. But as Nabonidus continues his conquests throughout the empire, he leaves his son Belshazzar in charge of Babylon. He is the ruler, the in effect ruler of Babylon. And in Daniel, he is actually referred to as a king. Now, some interpreters have some questions about that. They're not sure why he receives that title. But from extra biblical sources, it's clear he certainly had the authority of a king, and he certainly received the honors of the king. It's interesting to note then that in chapter 5, where Daniel is challenged to provide this or interpret this writing on the wall, Belshazzar offers him a position of the third highest ruler in the land. Well, that, of course, would make sense if Belshazzar himself was the second highest ruler, the son of Nabonidus. Now, Belshazzar remains in power until the invasion of Cyrus, which comes in 539 BC. And it's in this context where we see the next ruler mentioned in the book of Daniel. He goes by various names there. He's called Darius the Mede. The NIV has him Darius the son of Xerxes. The ESV translate that Darius the son of Ahasuerus. Various names. There is some historical controversy here because Daniel's the only one who mentions this individual by that name. In the book of Daniel, he is a king in Babylon. He calls all the shots in Babylon. That is the person Daniel has to do business with. Now, there have been various theories that indicate perhaps who this might be. His name doesn't appear in extra biblical sources, but we do find this individual by the name of Gobryas. He's the general whom Cyrus puts in charge of Babylon as Cyrus moves on in his military campaigns. And from the records we have of the period, Gobryas certainly acted the ruler. He acted the role of king. He received some of the honors of king. It is possible that he is designated by some as king. Again, we have no extra biblical evidence of this, but this might too be one of those occasions where Daniel gives us a view of history that we don't have from other places. So we just want to make you aware that there is that discussion going out there among interpreters. But we're going to assume it is the case that this is an actual individual that Daniel is reporting about. There is one more group of rulers mentioned in Daniel that we should discuss. They're not mentioned by name, but they're described with very accurate detail. In chapter 11 of Daniel, there is a long, detailed account of struggles between mostly the Egyptian Empire and the Seleucid Empire. And as interpreters have looked through that, they are very, very clear that these are concrete events that did in fact occur. We can put names to those events. In fact, the descriptions are so accurate, some people look at this and say, well, this must be an historic account. This must be a looking backward, a description of things that have already occurred. That's the most logical way to look at this chapter. And that's one of the main reasons we have this other alternative view of the origins of Daniel that was written in the 2nd century BC. That story in chapter 11 goes all the way up to the 2nd century BC, to the years maybe 167, 165 BC, where a ruler at the time called Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, he is oppressing the people of Judah, desecrating their temple, forbidding them from worshiping in the temple. So again, people look at the accurate account and say, wow, what's the most logical explanation that somebody from the 6th century was looking forward and describing this blow-by-blow account? Or should we look at his history, somebody looking backward in time and describing in a general way what took place? Well, we'll look at that story as it unfolds a little later in our sessions. But we just wanted to point out, as we're talking about rulers mentioned in the book of Daniel, there is this whole other list that are described but not necessarily named. So now that we've looked at a little bit of the historic framework in which Daniel is written, now let's look at some of the interesting content that unfolds throughout that framework. As I mentioned before, Daniel is a wonderfully complex piece of writing. There are so many tapestries woven together, themes woven throughout them. It will be impossible for us to get our arms around all of it. So I thought we ought to take a little bit of time here in the introduction to look at a few of the interesting collections of content that we find in the book. We'll get a little glimpse of them here, and some of them we'll look at in more depth as the study unfolds, but they help us get a sense of everything that's going on here. The first thing we look at are stories of deliverance. They're in the very opening chapters of the book. Powerful stories of how God shows up when things are challenged. We get right out of the box, we get this message of God's faithfulness to those who are faithful. You know, just because you serve God, just because you're faithful to God, doesn't mean that you're going to have a rosy life. I mean, these were the faithful people who are thrown into the fiery furnace. They're thrown into the lion's den. They are challenged. In fact, sometimes because you follow God so faithfully, you become the object of more intense persecution. So the messages are loud or clear through those deliverance stories that, yes, times will be difficult, but God is still there. You can't outdo God's faithfulness. As these people are faithful, God is even more faithful. And as God is faithful, he proves his sovereignty over these other kings. They may think they're the ruler of the universe, but God shows and proves historically that he is the ruler of the universe. So they're powerful stories given to help us see that as times go forward and things get difficult and the world seems out of control, the same God is still there. He's still reigning. He's still delivering those who are faithful, faithful to those who are faithful. And then we look at another collection of interesting visions and revelations. I mean, as soon as you read through the book of Revelation, the book of Daniel, you see all these revelations similar to the book of Revelation. There's this one image after another. Next week, we'll talk about apocalyptic literature and what that means. But part of it is a telling of the story through all these images, and we'll have to get to the bottom of them. How do you interpret them? And what we'll see next week is there are three key visions here in the book around which all the other structures are arranged. The visions in chapter 2 of the statue and the beasts in chapter 7, and the ram and the goat in chapter 8. Those are the key visions around which everything else is shaped. So we just see this kaleidoscope of images piled one on top of the other, all of which together give us this powerful picture of a sovereign God over the complexities of history who is working his plan through all of that. And then in addition to these visions and revelations, we have a collection of interesting, mysterious time references. We mentioned them earlier, the times and a half a time, the 77s, all this stuff. and they're scattered throughout the story. They're woven like threads, and they seem sometimes disconnected. But if we really step back and see them, they're all woven together. They're painting different sides of the same story of God. So they're also very critical to the story. So interesting, different dimension. And lastly, there is this wonderful collection of prayer and praise. This is a whole separate course by itself, a whole separate sermon series by itself. All these prayers and praise items that we find in the book of Daniel. In those chapters where God's people are praying, Daniel and his compatriots, they're praying for answers to prayer, for revelations, for explanations, for protection. And God shows up in all of those cases. He answers and responds to prayer. There's something being taught here about going to God in prayer and being confident of God's responses. And then there are the instances of praise by the kings themselves. I mean, you have Nebuchadnezzar on the front end and Darius on the back end, all of whom rise up and praise Daniel's God. They have their other Babylonian gods or Persian gods, but they're praising the God of Daniel. Now, of course, there's no reference to these praises in extra biblical material. They're only recorded here in Daniel, but it doesn't mean they're not true. It just means that we have a different perspective, that even they are brought to bear. Even the kings are brought to bear, are made to be held accountable, made to acknowledge, even against their will, that there's a king higher and more sovereign than they are. And then, of course, there's that wonderful prayer in chapter 9, the bulk of chapter 9, where we receive that perplexing vision of 77s. The majority of that chapter is a prayer. It's Daniel responding to the condition in the 70 years of exile, asking God, when is this all going to end? Is it about time for this to end? But he does it in such a worshipful manner, confessing the sins of the people, acknowledging what God is doing here, and asking God to vindicate his name. It's a wonderfully complex but beautiful, powerful prayer that's worthy of a study all by itself. So many different collections of material here in Daniel, and as I said, we're going to look at some of them, but we're going to have to leave some of them for you to explore on your own. But we'll give you a foundation so that they'll maybe make a little more sense to you as you look at those collections. Now we want to take a look at chronology in the book of Daniel. There are 9 very explicit, concrete references to dates in Daniel. Daniel is trying to write history here. The book is writing history, not myth, not legend. It is trying to tie these events to actual dates in history. The challenge is, of course, trying to map those dates to our modern dates. We're not clear on all the references there. And also, there's a challenge because these dates are kind of not always in chronological sequence. I'm one of those old-fashioned people that like a movie to start at the beginning, go through the middle, and end at the end. I get a little confused by all the foreshadowing and flashbacks. I'm not that smart when it comes to that. Daniel, he does a lot of that. There's a lot of flashbacks and foreshadowing. Events are taken out of sequence. And so it was helpful for me as I was preparing for this study to take these concrete time references, lay them down, and try to attach years to them. So you have that in your handout. We're not going to go through them in detail here in the video. But I did use them to put together a suggested chronology. Again, because the book doesn't always follow a chronological sequence. Generally speaking, it falls that way, but it takes certain episodes and it moves it around a bit. So I put together a suggested chronology. You can find it in your handout. If you're watching this on YouTube, online, in the comments section, there should be a link to the handout that you can get and download. But as I said at the outset, we're going to assume that the story starts at 605 BC and that what Daniel is reporting did in fact take place, that he was taken to Babylon. It's probably in the following year that Daniel and his compatriots are negotiating that different diet so that they could follow God their way, and God comes to their rescue, proves their way to be his way, to be the best way. And it's shortly thereafter, while Daniel is emerging from that training time, those 3 years of training, where he interprets the dream for Nebuchadnezzar of the statue that's given in chapter 2. It's also under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar where we have the story of the fiery furnace, where Daniel's compatriots are rescued from that furnace, and also where Daniel interprets the dream about where Nebuchadnezzar has about a tree and how God is going to cut down that tree. So that's all during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Then we move into the period of Belshazzar. Remember, Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, and Nabonidus was the successor to Nebuchadnezzar, still under Babylonian rule. It's during this particular period where Daniel sees the famous visions in chapter 7 and chapter 8, the beasts, the ram, the goat. It's all under the reign of Belshazzar. And at the end of Belshazzar's reign, we have the story of the handwriting on the wall. This is one of those things that are taken out of chronology. That's in chapter 6, before the earlier report of the visions. But it is the last event in Belshazzar's life, because you remember Daniel predicts by reading that handwriting on the wall that Belshazzar's reign is over. And sure enough, it was over. It's in that year where Cyrus invades. So we move from the period of Babylonian rule and Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. Now we're in the Persian period. And you recall that it's then that Daniel deals with Darius the Mede. Darius is in fact the king, as Daniel calls him, during the last part of his ministry there. It's there where he prays that prayer, probably just on the eve, if you will, right before Cyrus invades, his famous prayer in chapter 9, where he's asking God, when is this captivity going to be over? And sure enough, that year, Cyrus invades, and the following year, he sends the Judeans, or at least gives them permission to return home. So that's where that story occurs. It's also under Darius's reign where the story of the lion's den comes. Now remember, that was way up in chapter 4 in Daniel, but occurs near the end. So life was never easy for Daniel. He had a hard time when he got to Babylon. He's fighting about diet, all the other pressures there, and they're clear at the end. Under Darius, he's still being thrown into the lion's den. So he did not have an easy ministry. We kind of miss that if we don't set up this chronology. Also, it's during this reign of Cyrus that we see the final 3 visions. Visions given in chapters 10 through 12. And in chapter 10, we find out that happens in the 3rd year of Cyrus's reign. So about 537, 536, somewhere in there. And that's kind of the end of what we see in the book of Daniel itself. And you'll remember, we're kind of artificially, I guess, assuming sort of an end around 530 BC, which is the death of Cyrus. So at least that gives us a working chronology to begin to hand things on as we walk through this story together. And lastly, let me say a few words about other timelines. You know, Daniel covers hundreds of years of history, and there are 7 different kingdoms that it mentions by name. It's kind of hard to follow Daniel without a picture of history. And so we have to do a little homework. So what I've done at the end of the handout is give you a list of rulers for all these different kingdoms. So when you're reading through Daniel, you can look back and kind of see what's what and when's when, to maybe give, again, a little bit of perspective on the story. And finally, we want to ask the important question, what's the point? We always try to do this in our sermons and in our classes. When it's all reviewed, all the facts, the drawings, the charts, the images, what's the big point? Well, here at the introduction, I want us to focus on the very end, at chapter 12, verses 9 to 10. There's some powerful verses. a heavenly messenger speaks to Daniel and says, "Go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end. Many will be purified, made spotless and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand." The whole point of this revelation to Daniel is for understanding. I know that's sometimes counterintuitive because it's a difficult book to understand, but God is trying to communicate something to us about hope and about trust and about his faithfulness. The folks out in the broken world, they're going to continue to do what they do, but this is a word to people who are seeking to be faithful, people like Daniel. We're not perfect. We're not anywhere near as perfect, even as Daniel. But we are in the same kind of broken world. We serve the same God. We're seeking to be faithful. And God wants to assure us through this message to Daniel that he is still faithful to his purpose. Everything happening to us, he will work through that. And he's in this process of purifying, making spotless, and refining his creation, including us. This is all part of his work, and we can be confident in that. And those of us who get this wisdom, understand this wisdom, we're going to respond in faithfulness. So that's the bottom line, in my opinion, the big point of this opening session at least, that God will reveal things to Daniel that will inspire all of us to pursue faithfulness even in challenging times. I pray that this is a message that God breaks through to your heart as we undertake this study together. So come back next week where we continue our study exploring Daniel when God invades a broken world, where we'll take up the subject of looking at the big picture. Until then, may the Lord bless you.